David, our show today promises to be one of the most fascinating, most in-depth that you and I have done yet. How are you today?
I'm very well, and I'm fascinated to see where this ends up. We always discover on the fly, right?
We do. And the thing is, what people may not realize is that you and I have extensive conversations in the lead up to these shows. And I often regret that I haven't recorded those because the discoveries that we make just in our personal conversations are fascinating. So I want to give everyone just a little bit of background before I turn it over to you, because we're going to be talking about some things that are perhaps known to some people. Many of these things were not known to me prior to you telling me about them. And I think people are going to learn a lot and be intrigued. And I just want to say there are a number of individuals around on the internet who seem somehow dissatisfied with our process here. They want us to vet witnesses and stories and facts and details in the way that a traditional news information outlets such as the New York Times or CNN or the Washington Post would do. But it's important that our viewers understand that part of the reason I created Crowdsource the Truth was because I was extremely dissatisfied with the state of journalism, as it were, and the methods and tactics that those various mainstream news outlets utilize, even with extensive staff of individuals to supposedly ground truth, as you would say, to run down these facts and verify them. We're frequently seeing unsolved mysteries, unanswered questions, dissatisfying answers to some of the greatest mysteries of all time, such as who actually planned and executed the crimes of September 11th, 2001, or the Las Vegas shooting, or the murder of Jonbenet Ramsey, for that matter, a topic that you and I frequently return to, not because of the prurient nature of the crimes, but, in part because it is so devastating what could be done to this small child, that just the knowledge that a human exists who would do that is shocking to the sensibilities of normal people. But the fact that the crime remains unsolved is disturbing on so many levels. So what you and I have attempted to do here, David, is to create a new form of investigative journalism. And rather than finance that through the traditional means of advertiser-driven sponsorship by gigantic corporate-owned news entities, which are beholden to wealthy individuals, wealthy corporations in a way that you and I are not, this is an entirely new approach to investigation and dissemination of news, where we invite people to participate, and we certainly want them to do that by joining us on patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards and patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. Now, you and I have taken great efforts to diversify our reach on social media. Of course, I've created a Subscribestar page at subscribestar.com/crowdsource the truth for people who, for whatever reason, don't want to utilize Patreon. And you, David, have been doing extensive work in increasing your reach, of course, with the introduction of your new website, Reverse CSI Scripts, beautifully designed and certainly entertaining and informative for people to navigate and learn more about you and your research. You've also just joined Twitter, so I would invite our viewers to follow you at CSI Hawkins there on Twitter, and this is going to be a great outlet for you to share information and blog posts and all kinds of things like that. Now, today, we're going to be exploring an element of the Jonbenet Ramsey murder case, as well as looking into certain other elements that may or may not be connected. There's certainly nothing wrong with you and I speculating about possible motives, methods, perpetrators who would be involved in this murder of an innocent young child. And there's been so much mystery surrounding this. The fact that it's yet to be solved, as I said, is quite troubling. So you've introduced to me information about a Canadian serial killer who is a former Canadian Forces commander an individual by the name of Russell Williams. Now, I was not aware of this individual before you brought him to my attention. This is quite a disturbing man. We see him here in a photograph that he's taken. He's dressed in women's undergarments, or I'm not exactly sure what it is, a bathing suit, nightgown, something. But this is a man who is presently in jail in Canada. He's one of the most infamous serial killers in Canadian history, and I've spent several hours watching a police interrogation of Russell Williams. It's fascinating to observe. It's over 2 hours in length, and we see a police detective interrogate this man, and it's really interesting to observe his body language throughout the course of the 2.5 hours as he goes from being very closed off and reluctant to speak to this detective. Actually, he starts out acting rather normal, as if he is a decorated Air Force commander who has flown the Queen of England and other diplomats around. He's obviously quite capable. I would say the average person doesn't know how to fly a jet plane, hasn't had the extensive military training that this individual has had, but the revelations of this police interrogation are fascinating as we delve into the mind of a serial killer. And I want people to understand the differences between a mass murderer and a serial killer. Now again, this is all going back to the use of open source tools. Certainly, David, myself, and you, we haven't been trained as crime scene investigators, much in the same way I've made the analogy that although I know many people from my days at NYU who have BA degrees in photography and might be paid hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to be professional photographers, certainly any layperson snapping a photo with their cell phone is, in fact, a photographer, although they lack the credentials of a professional photographer. And there's certainly occasion, I think many people might have experienced themselves, where even an amateur photographer can take a photo that becomes world famous or is extremely important. So I'm not as concerned with the words that characterize you in terms of a forensic economist or whatever. I'm more concerned with what you or any amateur person in our audience might be able to do with some of these commoditized tools. I mean, certainly in 1996, when Jonbenet Ramsey was murdered, the average individual in their home did not have ready access to police interrogation videos and would not be easily able to observe the body language and listen to the spoken words of a serial killer such as Russell Williams. And so the individuals out there in the audience who might possess unique talents to make observations about these types of crimes are enabled by open source, publicly available tools that allow a crowdsource investigation into this type of thing to have such tremendous power that it can't be overlooked. So the distinction that I want to make between a mass murderer and a serial killer is that a serial killer is characterized by a calculated approach to choosing their victims and operating under a very specific modus operandi, frequently following a pattern or having identifiable methods that carry over from murder to murder, whereas a mass murder is typically characterized by a singular event, some sort of a psychological snap where an individual might kill a large number of people seemingly indiscriminately with no particular connection between the method or the individuals. The other thing I want to point out, David, is that there are a number of military veterans who have taken to criticizing you, criticizing me, seizing on individual statements in a way that's intended to disparage us or discourage people from participating in these crowdsource investigations or the financing of them by becoming subscribers on patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards or patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. But I want to reiterate my personal opinion that the simple fact of being a military veteran does not afford someone an automatic pass. It does not earn them respect automatically, because it is a fact that there are psychopathic killers who join the military, and even when they are veterans, may have evil tendencies. So we must scrutinize each person equally, and that is with the presumption of innocence until proven guilty. But of course, Russell Williams' confession to multiple rapes, torture, and brutal murder certainly supersede any accolades he would have earned as a distinguished member of the Canadian Forces. So I want to talk a bit about this today, David, and there is a certain other Air Force veteran who may be disappointed that we have not included his his likeness, let's leave it at that, in today's image. But quite frankly, I've become bored with this individual and his persistent attempts to shut us down. So I just want to point out a few things in the confession of Russell Williams, and then I'll turn it over to you and stop talking, David. But along the lines of him being a serial killer, he describes the stalking, targeting, rape, torture, and murder of 2 adult women in and around 2010. So this would have been 14 years later than the murder of young Jonbenet Ramsey. But it's remarkable to note that his military training comes into play in these murders. And we have observed, of course, how it seems entirely implausible for Jonbenet Ramsey's brother to have executed the murder, in that there are certain things that were done. The tying of the garrote that was used to strangle the young girl seems quite sophisticated and outside of the reasonable realm of capabilities for a 9-year-old boy, not to mention the various disturbances to her body. The crushing of her skull would require considerable strength, utilization of tools. I mean, setting aside the brutality, that it just seems hard to imagine that a 9-year-old boy could execute on his own sister. I would point out that Russell Williams did in fact crush the skull of previous victims with a blunt instrument. He admits to using a flashlight to crush the skull of one of his victims. He also did garrote and suffocate both victims with duct tape over their mouths. This is a remarkably similar pattern to the way in which Jonbenet Ramsey was tortured and killed. Williams also admits to staking out the house, entering through a basement window. All of these things remarkably similar to the murder of Jonbenet Ramsey. And of course, David, you have speculated. I would underscore that a lot of our investigations begin with speculation based on technological signatures at the crime scene, evidence at the crime scene, connecting that to methods, things, individuals that would have access to this technology, etc. And there are remarkable connections between Russell Williams and the way in which the Jonbenet Ramsey murder was perpetrated. And with that, David, I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much. A wonderful introduction, Jason. And again, it underlines the value of this ground truthing. That is to say, we can speculate till the cows come home, if you will, that the brother, the 9-year-old brother, did this. But if the media would only do its job, and that's a cry for help of the injured communities, which look to the media for some kind of truth. I mean, I find it absolutely disgusting and immoral that any media representative, no matter how naive or experienced, should ever imagine that the little brother could kill the sister and leave a ransom note. And if you look at the ransom note, I don't know how many 10-year-olds you know, Jason, that could write a note like that. I perhaps could have done, but I was fairly advanced. But you look at the language of this was a highly educated person using some rather unusual words, or at least words in an unusual sense from an American's point of view, like I believe most Americans call what is called in this ransom note an attaché, a briefcase. Is that correct?
I certainly would agree.
All right. And then there's internal knowledge and this bizarre signature go to the end, at least in my mind, of where this might lead. So the signature of this ransom note, which talks about this horrible treatment of the little girl, and it talks about two gentlemen having the girl under their control. So early in the day, or in this show, you mentioned it was hard to believe how a human being could do this to a little girl. And of course, it wasn't one human being, it was a team, a hit team, right? Which leads us to the title of today's show. But then it's signed off as Victory and SBTC. And I think that's a very odd term to sign off with Victory, having just tortured or having enabled the torture of a little 7-year-old girl in the most disgusting fashion. So apparently, there's about 20 different interpretations about what SBTC stands for. And I've come up with the idea that it stands for Spread Bit Teachers CAT, as in catastrophe bond fraud on the teachers' pension funds, which is the world's largest private pension funds. But we can explore that in a little more detail
and
later.
Certainly, David, nothing prevents you from speculating, from putting that piece of speculation out into the world and allowing people to ruminate on it and come to their own conclusions. Perhaps we will determine that that's incorrect and throw it away in the future, but it may lead to other evidence. And I just want to say, to my understanding, I believe, and we can double check this, I believe Jonbenet was 6 and Burke Ramsey was 9 at the time of the murder. So it's difficult for me to imagine that a 9-year-old child would even have the dexterity and motor coordination to write a ransom note that looks as neat. And I mean, you know, most 9-year-olds have pretty sloppy handwriting, and certainly the sophisticated language, as you've pointed out, would seem to defy the capabilities of such a young child, let alone the tying of a garrote, the crushing of the skull of his own sister. I mean, that's extreme, extreme torture.
Well, absolutely. And I'd like to say that any person working for the media around that time, that is Christmas Day, 1996, and the attack on the Pentagon, that fails to present the truth as they are best capable of understanding it, they are immoral and they should get out of the business. They shouldn't accept social engineers, to name a few, who come in and plant a story that is detached from the truth of the crime scene. And
Exactly.
Let me say this, I have friends in the BBC. The former Director General of the BBC, Greg Dyke, is a friend of mine, and still is, I assume, although I haven't had much contact with him. But I would say that the BBC is probably one of the worst offenders in this area, because they are continuously planting fake stories and fake news associated with a social engineering agenda. And the foci, if that's the right word, or foci of the BBC, which was formed in the 1920s and is the world's premier media organ of propaganda, entertainment, and news, seems to be sexual orientation, right, pedophilia, climate change, and battlefield torture, about how bad the Americans are, etc., etc., and the use of the language or the logic or the argument of conspiracy theories to dismiss ground truth statements about an analysis at a crime scene. And so you and I, and probably half of the thinking communities of the world out there who have a serious interest in solving these crimes, we're dismissed as conspiracy theorists. And I bristle, whether I'm describing myself as a forensic economist or a mechanical engineer or an expert in artificial intelligence. I bristle being described as a conspiracy theorist when I say to people, I'm interested in the facts at the crime scene. If you could go back to the opening collage, then maybe I could just go a few little details on this. So that ransom note, it talks about we are familiar with FBI and law enforcement technology.
Yeah.
Which is interesting, because I'm quite sure Burke was not familiar with FBI and law enforcement technology, to the point where the writer of the ransom note said that they could monitor any conversations, either presumably by the mother or the father, which might result or cause them to behead the child. Ooh. Well, what kind of logic is that? So, well, first of all, it's the logic of someone who really is familiar with law enforcement and FBI information technology and can intervene. So now if you zoom out and go back to the the bridge, above the head of the scantily clad possible killer, not necessarily the killer of Jonbenet Ramsey, but a serial killer nonetheless. You have a number of companies. You have the Boeing Company, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin. Right, those are four of the largest defense contractors in the world. And just to clarify, I'm not saying that the Lockheed Martin directors are corrupt or the Boeing directors are corrupt. I will say they're vulnerable to the kind of man-in-the-middle attacks or hacking attacks allegedly executed by people such as the ethical hacker, Mr. Swigert. So
and
now
certainly, David, Lockheed is aware of this and has special security procedures in place in the event that any of their directors are, or members of their family are, taken hostage, attacked, or otherwise used to somehow hold Lockheed Martin ransom. Isn't that true?
Absolutely true. I think they called it SOP, Security Operations Procedures. And Lockheed Martin had an established protocol with the FBI, in fact, to respond to any kind of threat to an executive of the company or a member of the family, and particularly if there's an indication of foreign terrorism. Well, the description at the beginning of the ransom note says, we represent a small foreign faction. So hypothetically, why wouldn't the Canadian, Russell Williams, who's a killer and started killing and raping very early, an expert lockpicker in a rented aircraft to Boulder, Colorado, as part of the NORAD Center program. I don't know if you've heard of that, but the military often will put on simulated or synthetic radar injects for children, and it's great fun. I think they've been doing it since 1947 to indicate that Santa is on his way to their home. And one of the legends that I believe I picked up, I can't necessarily find the reference immediately, is little Jonbenet Ramsey thought she was going to get a visit from Santa Claus on Christmas Day. And she told her friend, the friend told the mother of the friend, and the mother said to Jonbenet Ramsey, and this is all second-hand or third-hand, if you will, you know, Jonbenet, that Santa comes on Christmas Eve, right? So that in the morning you have the stockings, et cetera, et cetera. And I believe, again, second, third hand, I don't know if I can authenticate that, because, of course, the prime witness is now dead. But Jonbenet Ramsey is alleged to have said, oh, but this is a secret. So it's not beyond the realms of possibility that maybe in her princess pageants or whatever, someone in the area of Jonbenet Ramsey had said to her, you're going to get a visit on Christmas Day, keep it a secret, there's a lovely present for you. So hypothetically, someone who's an expert lockpicker could have flown down with a team, because remember the ransom note talks about two gentlemen have your daughter in their custody and they don't particularly like you. The suggestion is, I think, from the people who've analyzed that ransom note, it was being written by a woman sitting on the basement stairs outside the basement. So it would appear, at least from the ground truthing the data, there were three people in that house when Jonbenet Ramsey was garroted, possibly sodomized, her skull was fractured, and possibly tasered, right? So it wasn't just one individual psychopath, it was a hit team. Now, that can always be argued, you know, till the cows come home. But let's back up to this idea that there might be a group of teachers operating from within the world's largest private pension fund that would have major shareholdings in these defense contractors. So TIAA, CREF, back then it was called Teachers Insurance Annuity Association, College Retirement Equity Fund, the largest fund in the world, had around that time, and probably still does, major holdings in Boeing. Now, people talk about these contractors in a very negative way. Well, I've worked for major companies. Just my personal experience, engineers, scientists, and technical people that I've worked with all around the world, with Schlumberger, as far as I knew, every one of them just did the best job they could. They had no sort of ulterior motive. However, when a potentially radicalized organization like the teachers in the United States, or their equivalent in the United Kingdom, which is the University Superannuation Scheme, when these people accumulate a great deal of money in their pensions, they would, of course, have a tremendous leverage or concern about where it was invested. Now, I think you know that there are some extremely radical teachers, or at least associated with Chicago, including Bernardine Dawn, the leader or co-leader of the Weather Underground organization with her husband, Bill Ayers. Bernardine Dawn was on faculty at Northwestern University, and I think you've looked at Northwestern IT Partnerships, which is a global, immensely powerful from an electronic and communications and signals intelligence point of view, that has links to Chinese universities, Russian universities, a whole bunch of people who are not necessarily great friends of the United States, and it should concern what passes as the intelligence advisors of President Trump, what's going through the back door of Northwestern's IT partnerships. And could they, for example, hypothetically, develop an attack on the scale of 911 through those partnerships? Remember, Bernardine Dawn and Bliers, as founders, I think, of the Students for a Democratic Society, hence my interest in the word students and my website, and then I believe the leaders of the Days of Rage in Chicago in 1968, when I believe Christine Marcy, Philip McConnell's sister, had a babysitting gig, but I digress, would go on in the 1970s to go on the run. And they were never picked up because it appears they had a very sophisticated system for listening in on law enforcement communications. And I wonder where that came from. Anyway, their organization was penetrated, good word for these scum, by, I think, a Larry Growald, who asked them, well, what are they going to do if their revolution is successful? And he was told, and I find that rather chilling, and perhaps it should be informative to Americans, that they would probably have to kill 25 million Americans to secure their revolution. Well, that's a fairly tall order, at least to spring on the Americans, but they nearly pulled it off. Well, they didn't pull off that kind of numbers, but it could have been a prelude to those kind of numbers on 911, because had that fourth plane, United 93, hit the target in the Capitol building, then America would have been decapitated. And these vermin could have gone on to kill 25 million Americans to support their revolution. So you've got Bill Ayers was on faculty at the University of Illinois, Chicago, which is the home of the evil Batcave. Right? So now what you've got potentially from a technical point of view is the ability to join the Northwestern University's IT partnerships with the Federal Bridge Certification Authority, and provided you can find the technology that would allow you to infiltrate insiders that could communicate in total secrecy while they're developing a conspiracy, I don't know, to attack the USS Cole in Aden Harbor, to blow up the United States embassies in East Africa, to pull off 911, demolish the Capitol building, etc., then you're basically home and dry. Now, who had the technology that would allow you to support a man-in-the-middle attack on the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the normal kinds of people in the Boulder, Colorado police who might respond to an emergency call by Patsy Ramsey after reading or finding the ransom note at the bottom of the steps? Well, I think there's only one technology that I've been able to find, and remember, Serco has processed 4 million patents up to November the 15th of last year. The total number of patents that have been processed by the American Patent Office is 10 million. And once again, I say to the Americans, please ask a question. Why would you outsource the operation of the United States Patent and Trademark Office to the British company Serco? Why would you outsource the operation of the National Defense Ammunition Center to Serco? Why would you outsource the operation of the United States National Visa Center to Serco? Why would you download or outsource the operation of 60 FAA contract towers? And you've just recently been calling the Coast Guard, I believe, right? And I'm saying, well, I think I told you, you're not going to get much help from the Coast Guard when its intelligence services is run by Serco, the British company, to whom or to which I believe Mr. Swigart wrote, Serco International or Incorporated in Washington, notifying his alleged statement that you and I are tortiously interfering in the shareholders' investment in Serco, notwithstanding, of course, Serco International or Inc. does not have any shareholders because it's a wholly owned subsidiary of Serco. So the technology that I've invented, to cut to the chase, is, I believe, the time division multiplex software or encryption system that allows you to transmit bytes with time-stamped headers through multiple channels on fiber optic links with no latency problem. My understanding of a latency problem is that since you can assemble the bits and bytes at a later date somewhere by the time stamping, then you can remove anything or any issue. Like, for example, you want to detonate some explosives in the World Trade Center, but you don't want the detonation of the explosive on floor 88 to precede the detonation of the floor 89 one stop above if you're doing a top-down demolition, which is what they appear to be doing in the World Trade Centers 1 and 2. So people who are more expert than I am in that kind of encryption, I find this an extremely strategic invention where the patent was granted to Lockheed Martin, right, back in, I think, 4 months after little Jonbenet Ramsey was tortured to death. And remember,
well, it was filed. It was filed 4 months after.
Filed.
Granted,
so that would give them
1999.
Priority date, right? And then it was reassigned from Lockheed Martin to British Aerospace, I think in June of 2001. So my question, if you were able to get Marilyn Hewson, who's the chairman of Lockheed Martin, on an interview, I would like to ask her, why would Lockheed Martin transfer or reassign, if that's the right word, this extremely important strategic encrypted technology, which would allow you to hack into a network like the Federal Bridge Certification Authority or Northwestern University's IT partnerships and create a socially engineered perspective of an enemy such as a long-bearded guy in a cave in Afghanistan, when in fact you've actually got a man in the middle attack and the very survival of the Republic is at stake. Over to you.
Yeah, I mean, these are all extremely valid questions, David, and it seems that the more you and I ask these questions, the more we come under fire. So that's a curious set of circumstances in and of itself. You've referenced this contact that's been made to the Coast Guard. I don't know if people are fully aware of this. I think we've spoken about it in previous shows, but of course there's an individual out there who's taken it upon himself to contact Captain Jason Tama of the U.S. Coast Guard Sector New York with a rather alarming letter indicating to the captain, as you may be aware, the true target of a dirty bomb hoax appears to be the port of New York and New Jersey. New evidence available via open-sourced intelligence in social media provides indicators about the true intended target of the dirty bomb hoax of June 14th, 2017. Now, I think everybody knows the author of this letter is a certain individual who we have depicted in previous shows in a rather comedic political cartoon. I definitely consider my photographic collages to be political cartoons, and when people inject themselves into the public discourse that we're having here, they may inadvertently be making themselves into limited purpose public figures. And when they make certain statements, whether that be that it's their belief that NASA has a colony of slave children on Mars, or commentary on the investigations that you and I are doing, those individuals become de facto limited purpose public figures. Not to mention the very act of sending such an alarming letter to the captain of the Coast Guard here in New York, alerting him to a potential bomb hoax threatening his area of command. I've been instructed by the Coast Guard counterintelligence here in New York that, of course, a letter like this would automatically trigger an investigation. So people can come to the obvious conclusion that there is a Coast Guard counterintelligence investigation underway. To my understanding, of course, the Coast Guard doesn't share information with me of a sensitive nature, but I think we can all rest assured that people who serve Captain Tama are investigating these allegations of a bomb hoax. Certainly this is something I knew nothing about until Mr. David Swigert wrote this letter, which in and of itself seems like evidence that he has planned this alleged bomb hoax, much in the same way I suspect he had something to do with the planning of the alleged dirty bomb hoax on June 14th, 2017. Mind you, David, the Coast Guard doesn't share information with me about their investigations at all, so whether or not that was a bomb hoax or the Coast Guard actually found a threat to the port remains unknown to me. I certainly had nothing to do with the planning of that. This was information brought to me by a guest on Crowdsource the Truth, that guest being David Swigert's brother George Webb Swigert, and George's associate, who is now known to be a former contract FBI informant named Okie Marshall Richards. Curiously, Mr. Richards' identity was revealed to us by David Swigert. So there's a bizarre connection between all of these individuals sharing this information with me that they now attempt to attribute to me. But of course, David, any guest who appears on Crowdsource the Truth and shares their evidence or information, I don't necessarily agree with them or support them, but I open the forum to anyone to share evidence, and that doesn't mean that anyone will be allowed on the show. I need to be sufficiently convinced that this person is worthy of a platform, but I don't inherently endorse or agree with things that are said on the program. My guests' opinions and statements of evidence are their own.
Yes. So yes, thanks, Jason. So could you go back to the sort of opening collage? And
Absolutely.
I'm going to try and make the connection between some of the most interesting aspects of the Jonbenet crime scene investigation,
Yes,
and the one that pertains to the attack on the Pentagon of 9/11. So we
Yes.
look at a field actually on the collage where we have some evidentiary material, i.e. what we're looking at is in a hole in the inner courtyard of the Pentagon with probably, I estimate, 1.5 tons of debris on the ground on the inner side of the courtyard. And presumably, I mean, they want us to think there was a hole right through the walls of the Pentagon to the lawn outside. And just to give you a flavor of the importance of timing here, whatever it was that hit the Pentagon was traveling approximately 500 miles an hour at 6 feet elevation above the Pentagon lawn, and it punched a hole through 8 walls that had been reinforced in a program of upgrades called PenRen, Pentagon Renovation, by, lo and behold, a British company called AMEC as the principal arm of the construction side of the upgrade. Now, AMEC is an interesting company because its Vancouver-based branch was at 425 Carroll Street after the purchase of H.A. Simons. And the first 3 floors of that building were occupied by an outfit called Starnet Communications, which was the subject of a raid by 100 law enforcement people. And I come back to that phrase, law enforcement. We're familiar with the technology in the ransom note. And what intrigues me is the possibility or probability that the people who were familiar with law enforcement technology organized the raid on Starnet. So it's interesting to know what the raid was about or alleged to be about, and the destination of all the servers and files and computers that were confiscated. The commanding officer, the police commanding officer of that raid said it was like Star Wars in there, right? And Star Wars, I believe, some of the early visualizations of Star Wars was done on the evil electronic visualization laboratory in Chicago at the University of Illinois.
Is that
But
true?
I digress. Yes, I mean, I think if you put Star Wars and evil, right, you'll find that some of the early visualizations, which is why I want to have Lockheed Martin and its shareholders and its Serco shareholders pay us, right, or commission us, that's you and I, to put together the pilot scripts and storyboards and these kind of contextual videos so we can simulate or reverse engineer what happened at the Jonbenet Ramsey crime scene and what happened at the Pentagon to see if we can find some degree of commonality, right? And I think we're going to find it in that they used bit spreading encryption technology to launch a man-in-the-middle attack on the Jonbenet Ramsey household, right, where the police, the FBI, were being monitored to see if the Ramseys would call the FBI in for help, right? Now, as I understand it, the standard operating or security operating procedures of Lockheed Martin or any of these big defense contractors, as shown on your collage, is particularly if there is an indication of a threat from external terrorists, which would obviously be consistent with the claim that we represent a small foreign faction, as declared on the ransom note, and a threat to either the executive or members of the family, then historically, I believe, up to 100 FBI agents have swarmed the site, and the local police are given peripheral duties. At no time did the Lockheed security people or the FBI visit the Jonbenet Ramsey crime scene, and I think they were ordered to stand down, and again, we can test that hypothesis, by the kinds of people who know how to hack into emergency communication systems. And I understand that's a particular expertise of Mr. Swigart. Well, he's so dumb, he probably thinks I'm accusing him of being involved in the murder of Jonbenet Ramsey. I'm not. I'm actually probably accusing him more of hubris, where he thinks he's smarter than he is at hacking or ethical hacking.
He's certainly guilty of that.
That he left the door open, where far smarter people than him, such as the late Gareth Williams, the GCHQ spy, who was found locked up in the bath in the Holdall, and he's a Cambridge mathematician, which means nothing to lots of people perhaps, and I went to Cambridge, and I fancied myself, and still do, as the inventor of a particular branch of mathematics that relates to deductive computing. But I digress. I take this kind of thing as much for Jonbenet Ramsey or the murdered prostitutes out the pig farm or Mr. Gareth Williams. I take it very personally. I'm a human being on this planet with a decent mind, a good education, and when these vermin swim around and put their little games together for socially engineering the public into believing in climate change, or sexual orientation is a vital component of having an FBI that is efficient at investigating crime scenes, then I take it personally because, frankly, it's bullshit. Right? So, backing up, at that crime scene of the Jonbenet Ramsey, I believe there was a group of people with access to this patented bit spread technology who told the FBI and the security people at Lockheed to stand down. That is, the non-barking dog is absolutely vital to analyzing the crime scene. So you have to ground truth the difference between what actually happened at the Jonbenet Ramsey crime scene and what was supposed to have happened. What was supposed to have happened in a law-abiding, country is this is a defense contractor that is possibly being threatened by terrorists, infiltration. There should have been 100 FBI people to descend on that site. You put the Boulder police on the outside periphery. No one comes in or out. You put the yellow tape around it, and you start work on the investigation of the crime scene. You don't jump to conclusions, which the scuzzy media have done, and said, well, it's a 10-year-old or 9-year-old boy who might have done it, or the parents did it. So how much time was lost? Anyway, moving on. Let's go over to the Pentagon on the morning of 9/11. Now, if you look at that hole back on your collage at the back in the inner courtyard of the Pentagon, right? There is no way, and I don't need to do a simulation, that a aluminum, I'll give it the American pronunciation, an aluminum skinned Boeing civil aircraft can fly at 500 miles an hour, 6 feet elevation across the Pentagon lawn without being ripped to pieces by ground air turbulence, right? And it certainly wouldn't go through 8 walls of a Pentagon under construction by the British company AMEC and punch a nice circular hole on the inner courtyard. That had to have been done by something like a rocket boosted penetrator bomb patented by Lockheed Martin. So why wouldn't the continuity of government exercise on 911 have used assets from Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, and Raytheon in what was believed to be a continuity of government exercise where there was a lot of things being simulated, and someone would have access to that time division multiplex bit spreading technology and switch a simulation to a live fire event that resulted in the wrongful deaths of nearly 3,000 Americans on 911. So Mr. Swigart and your cronies, right, you should be, if you are legitimate, patriotic Americans, you should not rest until you find out or give to the public at large or your clients for ethical hacking a probability of your hacking being hacked by people who are not ethical hackers, right? Who might possibly believe that they are ethical hackers, but then they find they leave a backdoor into the system. So now what happened with this crime scene investigation at the Pentagon? Well, just after that hole had been punched through to the inner courtyard, if we'd gone down the holes, presumably right through, and there may have been internal explosives inside the building, but I come to that, but we probably don't have much time. Let's go to the outside, and about 10 to 15 minutes had been punched through, and Gerald DeConto and his colleagues in the US Navy Command Center had been obliterated, and I don't think been done. So it's quite possible that Captain Gerald DeConto had someone walk up behind him and put a couple of bullets from a Glock in the back of his head, and then walked out because they knew exactly when the weapons platform that was heading their way was going to hit. Well, anyway, so if you go 10 minutes or 15 minutes after that impact hole had been created in the inner courtyard, you'll find a line of people wearing FBI T-shirts, which doesn't make them members of the FBI. Yeah, there we are. And some guy, I don't know, is that a Glock in his trouser belt? But it looks like a very nasty weapon. How do I know that he didn't shoot Captain Gerald DeConto? And what the hell is he doing putting evidence in a brown paper bag?
David, let me interject there. Someone has been a reluctant contributor to the Crowdsource investigation, and in the course of disparaging you and I, has pointed out that actually paper bags are the preferred method of storing, I believe it said, biological evidence for some reason. So again, you and I don't profess to be trained military experts or trained at police investigation. We're simply two people who know how to access and observe things about information and pose questions. So the answer to the question of why they are using these brown paper bags could be found with FBI or other types of investigative training. And someone out there in the audience has pointed out that perhaps using these brown paper bags is standard procedure. So again, you and I are on a journey of investigation, asking questions, observing evidence, and learning as we proceed. It's certainly valid. Now, there's something here on the ground. Is this perhaps some crime scene indicator? This looks like a fire hose, actually. There we go. So, I mean, again, we're certainly free to ask questions and explore evidence, aren't we?
Oh, absolutely. But my point, I don't care whether it's in a brown paper bag or an attaché or whatever. The fact is, there is a group of people ostensibly wearing FBI T-shirts taking evidence away from a crime scene. That's a felony, right? That's before they've determined who or what hit the Pentagon. Therefore, that evidence is now, I don't say it's irretrievable. In fact, I've done a riff as a forensic economist or a thermodynamicist. Mr. Swigert, you can take your pick. Right? The second law of thermodynamics can be stated as evidence energy is neither lost nor gained in a process, but some energy is always wasted. Well, that applies to evidence. Evidence is neither lost nor gained in a process, but some evidence is always wasted. You see, there is evidence that these people are engaged in what is technically known as a felony, the spoliation of evidence at a crime scene. Right? Now, they may have done it in good faith because they've been told, look, this is a terrorist event, pick up all the evidence and we'll see who the terrorists are. But this 10 minutes after impact, it's not possible to determine whether it's a terrorist event. In the same way when General Alexander Haig, who incidentally the Chinese students should note, 4 months, I think, after the Tiananmen Square, General Alexander Haig was in China complimenting, if you will, or at least forgiving or condoning the Chinese for that terrible massacre where maybe 10,000 students were killed, bayoneted, their body parts washed down the gutter, etc., etc. A manifestation of a communist state at its worst, right? General Alexander Haig, former Supreme Allied Commander in Europe and special investor in CAI Private Equity Group, he went out there to China and he was really mad at the American administration for being cross with the Chinese for doing what they continue to do, as I understand, not perhaps on the scale of the Tiananmen Square massacre. And it was General Alexander Haig who interviewed, I think, on Fox News at 9 o'clock on the morning of 9/11, says, or is asked, who does he think is behind the attack? Because the north face of the tower number one bore the impact marks of a plane or a weapons platform. He said, I don't want to speculate, but we know where to look. It's the Palestinian or bin Laden groups. Jason, he's reading a script, right? This is the continuity of government exercise that was planned and rehearsed on the 1st and 2nd of June of 2001 under Amalgam Virgo. This was a continuity of government exercise that had been set up to go from simulation to live fire. And the only technology that I can find, I'm prepared to find, someone can tell me something else, that would be enabled to hack into all of the various responder communication systems, including the firefighters in New York, is this Lockheed Martin bit spreading technology that was then reassigned, presumably by the British company Serco, because it's all over the American Patent Office and has been since World War II, reassigned, I think, in June of 2001 to British Aerospace. So you had the most important, in my opinion, the most important man-in-the-middle potential encryption technology to maintain secrecy amongst the internal conspirators suddenly transferred from Lockheed Martin, which presumably had invented it, to British Aerospace, which I believe exploited it during the 9/11 attack. And British Aerospace would have been hooked through to, for example, the BBC, right? And through the BBC to Northwestern University's IT partnerships, hence Bernardine Dawn, the psychopathic bitch who gives lectures on torture, paradigms, and practice, married to the guy who wanted to kill 25 million Americans to protect his revolution. This is where the crime scene investigation should be focused. And I'd love you to invite the chairman and chief executive and president of Lockheed Martin, who I'm sure is a lovely lady, right? Her name is Marilyn Hewson. And I'm sure the Lockheed people who knew in his heyday Jonbenet Ramsey are as anxious as we are, Jason, to find out why the Lockheed security people stood down during the Lockheed Martin threat, I guess, with the ransom note, and why they appear to have stood down during the continuity of government exercise so that one of their assets, potentially, a rocket-boosted hardened penetrator, could be fired into the Pentagon, punch through 8 walls, create a debris field on the inside. This is what I call ground truthing, and have AMEC, the project, the project principal, right, for the construction of the Pentagon, be given a contract to take away the evidence. And the same company, AMEC, the British company, got a contract to do system vulnerabilities in building number 7 and upgrade the diesel systems. And AMEC got the contract to take away the evidence from the crime scene. And spoliation of evidence is a crime and therefore the coordination of the spoliation of evidence through whatever technology they used. I think they used the Lockheed bit spreading technology, is a crime as well.
Yeah.
Over to you.
David, we've got a rather slow viewer who feels it necessary to put a comment in that makes little sense. Basically dissatisfied that you and I apparently repeat the same themes without showing evidence. Well, certainly we're showing evidence of the capabilities of a rocket-boosted, hard target penetrating bomb. That's explained in the patent description. We're certainly showing evidence of the destruction, photo evidence of the destruction of the Pentagon, and making various connections. Now, you've presented one element of evidence, which is the testimony, the video interview given by Alexander Haig on the morning of 9/11. I think it's worth pointing out, and correct me if I'm wrong, David, I believe Alexander Haig was the Secretary of State under President Ronald Reagan. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes, and he's also a special investor in the CAI private equity group, which acquired, together with a couple of pension funds, a controlling interest in McDonnell Dettweiler and Associates, which is now called Maxar Technologies.
But let me add this, David. If he is the Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan, he would certainly have, we could assume, close contact with Ronald Reagan's Vice President, George H.W. Bush, who had left his position as director of the CIA to become vice president. And of course, after his presidency, which followed Ronald Reagan, he was involved with the Carlyle Group. His deputies and close associates created the PNAC, the Project for a New American Century, which is famous for putting out their manifesto, which was also called the Project for a New American Century, which spoke about the need for a new Pearl Harbor style event to galvanize the American public and basically to create the need for this now 18-year-long war that's been happening in the Middle East. Now, David, we're getting close to the end of our time for today, so I just wanted to go over a few things that are pertinent to what you've been discussing and what we've been talking about here today. I'm not very familiar with this, but I, in the course of Googling and during our conversation, found this article from 2011, which is closely coincident to the arrest of Russell Williams, who I wonder if there's any familial relationship between Russell and Gareth Williams. Probably not. It's a very common last name, but of course it's a possibility we could speculate about and investigate. But this article talks about Lockheed Martin hack being investigated by the FBI. So is there no evidence that you and I are questioning whether or not Lockheed Martin could be hacked in some way? Maybe people can dig into this article and determine how Lockheed Martin might be penetrated and what the purpose of such a hack would be. So to those who are dissatisfied by a lack of evidence, well, I think we're presenting quite a bit of evidence. Doesn't mean we have conclusions yet, but these are complex investigations that you and I are endeavoring to move forward. And it's quite curious, the individuals who surface to try to stop us from doing that. We appreciate it when people point out factual errors that we may make, or statements that we make that might be incorrect or uninformed, such as questioning why the FBI would use a paper bag. We've learned something, that the paper bag is the preferred container for biological evidence, which they may well have been looking for.
Yeah, but my point again is the FBI should not be taking away evidence from a scene of a crime. It's obviously a crime, prejudging that it's a terrorist event, so any evidence will help them identify the source of the terrorism. That's to say, precluding the possibility that it's an act of domestic terrorism, which it so manifestly is. My point about the difficulty if we pursue the beyond reasonable doubt argument into a criminal attack. These people have stitched up the crime scene investigation procedure, so it's totally fake and bogus. Where did Robert Mueller, when did he stop the FBI team going to Porton Down to analyze the very strong possibility that the anthrax attack, the source of the anthrax attack, was important doubt. My point is now that eventually I think we'll be leading through this ground truthing process. We can help students at the University of Illinois, Chicago, or any other university that is connected up to that technology, ground truth the theories visited upon them or inflicted upon them by what I would describe as rogue teachers. That is to say, members of the teachers' pension fund that might include Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dawn, who wanted to kill 25 million Americans, Hillary and Bill Clinton, who lectured in law, I think, at Arkansas University, and Barack and Michelle Obama, who are heroes to, I think, their colleagues in the teaching community, but presumably beneficiaries of these pension funds that would have a major investment in Lockheed Martin. So you've got a conflict of interest. These people who say, well, we believe in sexual orientation or climate change or whatever, they actually are invested in companies that profit from these rackets. Over to you.
Right. And as I said, David, we're just about out of time. So the one last thing I wanted to leave everyone with today is that I only noticed this quite recently, but at the crime scene investigation of the Pentagon, there was this symbol drawn, or rather, looks like spray painted, on the wall on either side of this hole that's been blown into the Pentagon, which I agree does not seem like the hole that would be made by a jumbo aircraft. I mean, even in comparison to the hole that we see in the World Trade Center, which is quite obviously elliptical, where tremendous kinetic energy is generated by the engines and the wings. This is just, seems more characteristic of a rocket-boosted, hard-target penetrating bomb. But back to this symbol, we noticed that it seems like the symbol for anarchy, but then it says MDTF1. Well, Googling MDTF1 brought me to this Montgomery County, Maryland Fire and Rescue Service, which has a task force called Maryland Task Force 1. And it is a FEMA urban search and rescue task force that does say, right on its own webpage, that they were involved in urban search and rescue at the Pentagon terrorist attack in 2001. Doesn't say the Pentagon crime scene, so it's a Pentagon terrorist attack, of course, Oklahoma City bombing. So again, I'm not accusing Maryland Task Force 1 of being involved in anything. I'm just simply pointing out that they've apparently painted that symbol, or someone who is aware of them has painted that symbol on the Pentagon. And I think it's fair to draw a preliminary conclusion that they were there and involved. And perhaps there's more that we can learn from looking at their webpage and understanding what their involvement there was. Someone says it's a USAR symbol. I don't know what USAR is, but again, this is how we are conducting our investigation. This is crowdsource investigative journalism. We ask questions, and the vast knowledge of the thousands of people who view our videos help us get to answers. So it causes me to question the motives, David, of people who would seek to stop us from doing that. You've spoken quite a bit about spoliation of evidence and how it affords us what is the word that you use, a presumption of guilt?
An aggressive inference of guilt, you see. Right. And again, I mean, this clown, Mr. Swigert, I hope I don't be disrespectful. I'm sure he's got other talents. I just don't see a lot of them. But why would you put an email address, spoliationnotice@mailbox.com, and then send messages to the Coast Guard saying there's a hoax when your email address indicates that you're probably spoliating evidence of a hoax that's been generated by your brother? Over to you.
Or himself. We don't know who's generated the hoax, but certainly there is a lot of evidence that points to him. One last note on the spoliation of evidence, David, and I apologize, you won't be able to see this, but Mr. Swigert has also been aggressively spoliating evidence from his own YouTube channel. He made a video at the Mesa, Arizona post office on December 1st, 2018, where it's my understanding that he presented himself with the cooperation of the owner of P.O. Box 152 in that post office, he added himself officially as a recipient of mail at that post office. And he's used that address as his official address of record with the United States District Court in the Southern District of New York, where he's brought a frivolous lawsuit against me in what I believe is an effort to stop Crowdsource the Truth from moving forward with these types of investigations. So again, it raises the question of why does Mr. Swigert delete this video? YouTube certainly doesn't charge to store videos. I've got thousands of hours of videos on YouTube, so there's no need to delete this video unless it is some sort of attempt to send out a message and then remove it from the internet so that I cannot refer to it in answers to his lawsuits, indicating that he is present at the post office on December 1st when I allege he met with the owner of the post office box and conspired with that owner to add himself to the box, which I believe is a furtherance of a fraud on the court in the Southern District of New York. And by the statute that I read about mail fraud, any use of the United States Post Office in the furtherance of a fraud, including a fraud on the court, is mail fraud. And that has a maximum penalty of 20 years in federal prison. So it's curious to me that Mr. Swigert and the owner of Post Office Box 152 would put themselves at such dramatic risk of felony prosecution for violating such a serious statute in the effort to sue me to stop us for investigating crimes that maybe they're involved with. I don't know. We haven't seen any direct evidence that they're involved, but it is curious that they don't want us investigating it, isn't it?
Yes, and could I respond to that? So
Please.
This bit spreading technology, invented perhaps by Lockheed Martin, perhaps by someone else, and then reassigned to British Aerospace, would allow you a backdoor into the federal bridge on which the post office sits, right, together with the United States Patent and Trademark Office and the United Kingdom Ministry of Defense. So I would argue that these social engineers, which include the BBC, are watching the response. And that's why, if you could just go back to my website, I've got those reverse binoculars.
Yes.
What I'm saying is they're watching us as we do our crime scene, and they're adjusting the evidence that is presented to the public at large to deflect us, right? So that's why I've got this phrase, students, teachers, ground truth, CSI. Right. I think this is, well, I hope people have enjoyed today's show. But what I want to indicate is that whenever you have a crime scene, you don't assume it's terrorism. You assume, first of all, it's crime. And if there's crime, there's criminality. You look for the crime organization. So by looking at what happened to little Jonbenet Ramsey and the ransom note and what happened to the Pentagon, I think there's very clear evidence that these people, wittingly or unwittingly, willingly or unwittingly, are leaving a backdoor into what I think Swigert referred to in 1992. He said he was working with Booz Allen and Hamilton on classified networks. Yeah, I think he was. The question is, how smart is he? Right? So, you know, Booz Allen and Hamilton organized these continuity of government exercises called top-offs. So how do we know that, not as smart as he thinks he is, left a back door into the continuity of government exercise on 9/11 or the Lockheed response to the threat to little Jonbenet Ramsey, and nasty, thoroughly nasty people, I'm sure, Swigert wouldn't sit down for a beer with, have come in behind him because he's incompetent. He's left the door open. They've executed the attack. Then they've retreated and closed the door. So it kind of looks like he was a good ethical hacker, but after the event, there's no evidence that actually proves he's incompetent. Over to you.
Well, there's no evidence that proves that he isn't incompetent as well, at least not at those crime scenes. We've actually observed a significant amount of evidence indicating that he may in fact be incompetent. So people are left to draw their own conclusions on that matter. And hopefully we are helping people identify evidence that will help them draw those conclusions. With that, David, I think we're going to wrap up today's show. I would like to remind our viewers that you and I do another show every Friday, usually begins right around the same time at 1 p.m. Eastern on YouTube, and then the bulk of our material is shared on patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards and patreon.com/crowdsource the truth, as well as on subscribestar.com/crowdsource the truth. I also want people to go and visit your excellent website, which we've shown earlier. Of course, it's Reverse CSI Scripts, totally free for people to look at that, and they can review information that you've got on there. And new this week, just the other day, David is now on Twitter, so people can follow David on Twitter. He is at CSI Hawkins. You can link to his webpage from there. And we certainly invite everyone to follow David on Twitter. David, this has been a fascinating discussion. I think there's quite a bit more for people to look into with regard to Russell Williams, his modus operandi as a serial killer, the similarities, the remarkable similarities into the methodology he employed in the brutal torture and murder of his victims, and that of Jonbenet Ramsey. I'm not sure to what extent this individual has been looked into as a possible suspect in the murder of Jonbenet Ramsey, but it certainly seems coincidental, his penchant for preying on the weak, attacking them while they sleep, entering through basement windows, taking victims down to the basement, doing things with them in their underwear, sodomizing the victims, strangling and suffocating his victims with rope and duct tape. All of these are characteristic of the torture and murder of young Jonbenet Ramsey, a murder that remains unsolved. Sorry, David?
And there's the beaver hair that was found at the crime scene. Well, beavers are very Canadians. I don't know that there are many in Boulder, Colorado. But if this guy, and I was trying to find out whether there was a beaver hat associated with the Canadian Air Force, but certainly is, the country is flooded with beavers, right? And you could easily pick up a beaver hair and take it into the basement. Now, is that a plausible explanation for the beaver hair? Most important thing from a ground truthing point of view is you've got to come up with some explanation for a beaver hair before you can confidently say that you've investigated this crime. Over to you.
Yes. I agree with you, David. And we've got people who are, wordsmitter on Periscope says the connection to Lockheed is BS. That is a totally worthless argument.
Well, that's ridiculous. I mean, he was a very well thought of Lockheed director, and he worked on the Pentagon contract, all the equipment used for this bit spreading system in the Pentagon renovation project. So,
and even if he hadn't, simply saying, "Oh, that's BS," is not an argument. If you've got some evidence that contradicts what we say, we're certainly open to hearing that, but otherwise, anyway. David, that's all for today. We'll be back on Friday. Thank you so much for joining me, and thanks to everyone for watching. I want to thank our generous sponsors on Patreon. We couldn't carry on with this work without you, and all of the individuals who seem so eager to spoliate evidence are also eager for you not to become a sponsor. So if you're down with destroying evidence, stopping investigations, and hurling arguments like that's BS, by all means, don't become a sponsor, don't watch the show. But if you think what we're doing is of value, please become a sponsor. Visit patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards or patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. Thanks for joining us today, David. I'll speak to you soon.
Thank you, Jason. Bye now.